Well, welcome to the Tomorrow Summit and our panel on lessons from Africa. My name is Thomas Steele-Maley. I am the Director of Foresight and Design for GEMS Education and a strategic advisor to the Varkey Foundation. We're joined with an esteemed panel from Africa, and I wanted to introduce Kirsty Chadwick, who is the CEO of TTRO, who will give you a little more information on that shortly. Warda Conrad, who is from the Western Cape University. James Martin, who is the CEO and founder of Ingenie. We have Brian Schreuder as well, who is the Superintendent General of Western Cape Education Department. And we may be joined by Dr. Mweli soon, so don't be surprised if another person shows up on the stage. So just to give a quick background, and then we're going to have a loose discussion about the general direction of South Africa and educational technology within South Africa. But first, the impetus of this panel and the impetus of the Next Billion Prize and the Tomorrow Summit was really to look at educational technology in a new lens. And that lens being one that had a specific indigenous perspective. So what would educational technology look like that didn't overlay some Silicon Valley idea of what others need, read colonialism or otherwise, but what would it look like to actually serve the next billion people with the next billion people's perspective? And so it is absolutely crucial that we have that perspective. So we partnered with Western Cape in the Next Billion Prize. The winners of the Next Billion Prize have a chance to pilot their work within Western Cape and start that relationship. So this panel is an extension of that for those in the audience who are actually pitched, but those that are interested in working in the space of the developing world to get a closer look at what actually is happening on the ground. What are the benefits? What are the barriers? And along with that, we have James and Kirsty here, who offer a very unique insight into what has been successful at scale. And then also what is already happening to incubate and move forward companies that have that indigenous lens. And so I would open up the panel first, if we could, with a perspective from the Department of Education, just to ground us in what is the state of education in South Africa, and then specifically, when you're thinking about educational technology, what are the needs? What are the barriers? What's the disposition right now in South Africa?
Well, firstly, South Africa is probably a microcosmos of Africa. It's not homogeneous, and therefore any thought that it might be homogeneous would be erroneous. Very diverse country in the first place. And there are two parts of the country where there's a great advancement in the utilization of technology for teaching and learning. Western Cape, where we come from, where Warda and I come from, is largely the leading province. Gauteng is the other province that has made great strides, but there are also significant differences in the approach that we follow in the two provinces. So there's a huge need, and anyone that's coming in that wants to do a national rollout has to understand that they've got to be flexible enough to meet with of the poorest and most difficult communities, rural communities, versus a Western Cape where there is some of the greatest initiatives that would compare to first world countries. That's part of the challenge. But even in the Western Cape province, 1 million kids, 1,500 schools, even in that province, the diversity is great. Great poverty, and also of the best and of the richest schools in the country, and certainly in the province. The state of digital utilization of education, we've got a strategy for a number of years now that's called the e-learning strategy in the Western Cape. We believe in creating an enabling environment, and by the end of last year, all our schools, bar a small group of rural schools, were connected with high-speed broadband, which will be upgraded to greater speeds in the next 3 years. So we've got the enabling wide area network. We have across the province free Wi-Fi that's already connected in thousands of communities, creating access to people, not great Wi-Fi, but free Wi-Fi. In our schools, more than a third of our schools will, by the end of next year, have a Wi-Fi blanket over the school so that there's the high-speed Wi-Fi. We've got more than 6,000 digital classrooms already in the province. But that's not typical of the whole South Africa. That's typical of our province that's, in a sense, visionary, leading, and has been at the cutting edge for a while. So challenges and issues that we have is around content, around partnerships, around funding, and we'll speak later on about some of the challenges that you will face, namely procurement issues, that in a bureaucracy is always a pain in the butt. And I'm sure Kirsty and Jamie will speak a bit more about that. But what is unique about our context is the approach to innovation. We nurture innovation, we welcome innovation, we believe in experimentation. Because of our diversity, one size does not fit all. And so in that context, particularly the Western Cape is a fertile ground for anyone who wants a springboard to South Africa, and in fact, a springboard to Africa. We found it interesting that there are a lot of initiatives in Kenya and Uganda and Rwanda, etc. And that is correct because the need is great, but it is not yet a full regional availability and enablement, whilst the Western Cape offers that. So we welcome the partnerships and we cherish the partnerships, but I think one has to know that it's not tough. Principally, we will speak, and I'll speak a bit more later on, about the importance of anyone coming in, making sure that the context that you utilize is aligned to our strategies, and not trying to force in something that maybe works elsewhere in the first place, or secondly, is your own passion. It's got to work for us, and many of the startups that we saw can, with maybe flexibility. And so the opportunity is certainly there.
Thank you.
I think it's also important that we understand the political and socio-economic context of the Western Cape. So anybody coming in must make sure that they do their homework and understand and the need for the sensitivities around it, and they must understand the potential challenges that they will experience as a consequence of that.
Perhaps just to say they must know who to speak to, and that would be me. And the reason I say that just is because it's a complex issue in any African nation, and South Africa as well, and therefore it needs to be someone that understands the dynamic, understands the politics and the various politics, because it's also not a uniformity of politics, but also understands the bureaucracy that can advise potential startups, potential interested parties. Otherwise, they're going to go down tracks that's going to waste their time and their money, frustrate them endlessly. In fact, they're going to be frustrated anyway. Yeah. But at least we can minimize the frustration to some degree.
Yeah.
That's great. So, building on those ideas of diversity, an innovative, ecosystem, along with understanding how to navigate that. I think, Kirsty, you have a very unique story. In fact, just a background, when I actually met Kirsty for the first time, we were designing this prize, and I immediately saw exactly what we would hope for in the first couple of years, although accelerated and had already done it. So a very unique take. But you're not originally from Africa. You have been very successful in Africa. So what was your recipe, and how did you figure that out?
Sure. So I'm originally from New Zealand. Been living in Cape Town, South Africa for the past 12 years. Started the company Training Room Online in 2008. So I've got 10 years in EdTech experience, not only in schools, but also across the world of work. So we do a lot of corporate learning and development programs. And we've built a team of about 150 people now, so we have quite deep capacity and capability in digital learning solution design. Specifically looking at the work that we've done with schools, and I really do applaud what the Western Cape have achieved, and Brian's exactly right in what he said around the differences between initiatives in the Western Cape versus the rest of South Africa, and certainly the differences that are then extended into the rest of Africa. So it's a complex landscape. We started work with the National Department of Basic Education in 2012. So on a national level, the scope of that project was from our component of it, to create a platform and aggregate digital content that is aligned to the CAPS curriculum in South Africa. So undertaking that means that there are 26,000 schools, there's roughly 12 million children in the public school sector. So it's a very, very big and diverse range of schools that we've got to be able to reach. And I think what Brian has described as the infrastructure and the rollout of connectivity in the Western Cape, that is quite unique to the province. It's certainly not that we've got that across the country by any means. And I think, some of the greatest challenges we've learned over the last 5 or 6 years of working with the department at a national level, firstly to understand the dynamics of the different sort of political plays across different provinces, so it's not the same. You've got to do a lot of lobbying, get a lot of buy-in across the country in order for the initiative to be successful, even working with government. Our first approach was we were under contract with Telkom, which is one of the largest telcos in South Africa, and we were working with them. The Department of Basic Education was the beneficiary, and the Department of Communication was the sponsor in terms of funding the solution. So just the stakeholder engagement was incredibly difficult, and we were by and large unsuccessful in everything we did for the first 4 years until we found ourselves into a direct partnership with government in a public-private partnership model under a memorandum of understanding that says we can now manage this platform as a service for and on behalf of the department. We can work with the contributors of digital content and aggregate those into the platform. So we're doing a lot of the legwork behind that, and with the department supporting the deployment and the rollout. So I think once we got into that model of not being a service provider to government and being in a partnership with them, we found a huge amount more success, and also just the ability for what we could innovate and design in the platform, understanding some of the challenges gave us a really different perspective of how we were going to build the solution. So we almost rebuilt the entire platform again last year to accommodate for the fact that what we'd been instructed to build and what the need really was, there was a complete mismatch in that design. So yeah, a lot of blood, sweat and tears, I would say, is what goes into making it successful. But it's something that we've always felt, is really, really necessary for us to use our expertise in what we could do and apply that in the public school sector in South Africa.
Great, thank you so much. And so, if we think about that, those lessons learned and now that historic memory that can hopefully, you can be of an influence to other companies in a globalized world. We know that as companies try to understand, empathize, and I'll be honest, monetize the developing world, it's going to be increasingly important that they understand that landscape as well. I know that, not to encourage competition in any way, shape, or form. But I think we've heard in this conference as well that it's going to be vital, necessary, and most definitely certain that there will be true indigenous actors, so South Africans that are creating the next generation of ed tech and business, and really bringing some of those initial lenses that others have to figure out to the table already. And so I think, James, do you want to speak a little bit about being the founder of the first ed tech incubator in South Africa, if not Africa?
It is across Africa.
Across Africa, and what you're seeing, what you think the future holds, if you want to speculate, and then maybe some of the things that you've dealt with along the way.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the sort of core, you talk to any tech investor or any tech innovator, they'll say that one of the core things you need in a good tech entrepreneur is often that they've confronted the problem they're trying to solve, and that's sort of quite core to our philosophy. So our philosophy is that we support early stage ed tech entrepreneurs who are either from or operating on the continent. And the reason we do that is because of that fact that people have often confronted the problem themselves in their own education or in their own lives. And so what we often find is that people create innovations that would never be created by other organizations from outside of the continent, because it would make no sense, for example, to create an innovation in America that does some of what our guys do. And so I think what we found is that there are sort of challenges which entrepreneurs from outside would face coming in that our guys obviously don't face. So what we do is that every 6 months we put out a call for applications. Entrepreneurs who are based anywhere, we're actually not very concerned about where people are from, we're concerned about where they're based and where they operate, who are based anywhere on the continent can apply, and we then give them $50,000 of seed funding and a 5-month incubation program to help them scale their business. And what we found is a couple of things. One is we've had absolutely overwhelming response. So we got 170 applications the first time around, where actually our call is currently open. So if anyone knows a great EdTech early stage entrepreneur in Africa, please tell them to apply. But we've already had 200 applications in 2 weeks to our second cohort. So that there's enormous innovation happening. And the second thing we found is that the challenge for an entrepreneur from outside coming into the continent is always context. The challenge for a lot of entrepreneurs on the continent is very different. And it's actually very, very varied in terms of what we find. But in terms of some of the things which we've brought into our incubation we've seen happen, I referenced things that would never exist somewhere else. There's a couple of good examples from East Africa. One of them is a company called Mtabe, who have built what effectively is an offline Wikipedia of the Tanzanian school curriculum. So a very common problem is that children will be in areas with poor connectivity, will have parents who aren't particularly well educated, and might well have a school or a teacher that isn't particularly well trained. And so often for supplementary content, the internet would be a great place to turn, except you can't access it. So what Mtabe have done is they've built this content offline based on the Tanzanian school curriculum, and then built an artificial intelligence engine which via text message can search it. So all you need to do is have a most basic possible mobile phone and send a text message to Mtabe, and it will then text back a response to your question. So you might ask them, when did Tanzania gain its independence? And it will text back not just the date, but a sort of Wikipedia-style description of the independence process. Another one is very easy to give you because the entrepreneur is sat just there. So Zakani, who is a gentleman sat in the front row there, who's as tall as me but much better dressed today, runs a company called Steele-Maley. And I think that's a great example of what I talked about earlier. Zakani will tell you his own story better than I can, but was a sort of top student at his school in a less advantaged area of South Africa who had all the grades he needed to go to the top universities, except in maths, because there wasn't a maths teacher at his school. So what Siafunda have done is they have created Siafunda digital libraries, which get the content from the best teachers, initially in STEM, but now they're broadening out to more subjects, place it on a digital library, and then place that into schools. They also implement as well. And again, that's an innovation. No one growing up in London, where I was born, thought, I know what I'll do. I'll provide something for people without a maths teacher, because that's not a reality in the UK, whereas it very much is a reality for people from Zakani's background and others. And so I think that's the most exciting thing that we found, is very commonly our entrepreneurs come forward with those, I've experienced this problem, I'm passionate about changing it type innovations, and hopefully us and others can get behind them and help them scale.
So if I may just comment, Jamie has done great work, but there's one challenge, and that challenge was that they were also seeking incubator startup solutions also for education, not only for education, they were doing it generally, but they did that without speaking to me, without speaking to us. And so we've linked up in the last year or so, and in fact the Western Cape government is also, due to some other conversations that happened, also investing in such incubation of education-based solutions. So again, there's a lesson. We got to speak so that we can align and also get faster and greater benefit out of the solutions.
I think that's right. I think that's a challenge I think there's always, I was in Nigeria 2 weeks ago, and I think one of the things we're very lucky about is that Brian does engage very well with us, and the Premier actually, the Premier of the Western Cape is incredibly supportive of what we do. Whereas I was in Nigeria a couple of weeks ago, and I said to entrepreneurs that I was there, I said, look, I'm here for a week, who should I meet? And I said, you've got to meet this incubator, you've got to meet this investor, you've got to meet these startups. And I said, what about the Ministry for Education? How do I, and all these sort of startups looked at me like, why would you want to meet them? And I think that's a real challenge, is that the Western Cape, I think we're lucky that we have people like Brian and Wanda, and we have a Premier and a Minister for Education, or MEC for Education, who are very interested in this area. Whereas in other countries on the continent, you do tend to find that people just find it best to go outside of government. However, those governments there, basically sort of rooting around, hold lots of power and hold lots of money.
But
So
I don't
it's a
blame
real
them,
shame.
because even in the Western Cape, there are many people that will say they went to the Western Cape Education Department, just got closed doors for years. I mean, Kirsty might say the same thing. And so the openness of government, people knock on the doors and they don't get anywhere, so they just go around it, which is also not a bad thing.
It's largely,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
sorry, I think it's largely due to the fact that there hasn't really been a central directorate within the Western Cape Education Department that deals with external stakeholders or external potential providers or partners in the past. However, we are rectifying that as we speak. And one of the other things is, because of the procurement red tape, startups and other companies, other providers would normally go directly to the schools as a way of circumventing the department and the bureaucracy that sits within the department. What that does, however, is it creates a problem where however fabulous your item is or your product is, and however fantastic your evidence base is of its success, it's pointless because you haven't brought it back to the department. The ability to scale at the kind of level that you want to as a startup, you can't do without having a partnership with the department. That is why the partnership aspects of it is so important.
Well, and so two things. One, Brian is here. Anybody that wants to start a company or have any kind of scale within South Africa, you should catch up with him before the end of the conference. One of our goals for the summit, by the way. But I'm interested in the innovation engine in Western Cape, and then this idea of scale, because there's a learning scientist that I sort of grew into the industry with named Ruben Pintadura, and he's got a simple model, SAMR. Technology can substitute, it can augment, it can modify, or it can redefine education. And so one of the tensions I think we're dealing with this conference and looking into the future is, it's somewhat easy to scale something that replicates traditional and modern education.
Exactly.
But we've heard from over and over in this conference, we know these things, that everyone, and certainly the developing world, are going to need their own 21st century conception of education. So my question, may be a hard one, is in that innovation engine, in that relationship with new ed techs, or maybe even in the construction of the overall curriculum and pedagogy, how are you addressing that tension of looking at ed tech as possibly supporting or even proliferating new directions in education?
I'm going to deflect a bit, if I may, to Warda in a minute. Okay. Let me just say that part of our vision has been that EdTech is not there for EdTech's sake. In our vision, digital technology is going to transform education in our province, if the country might be a bit slower. But it's going to transform teaching and learning. So we understand that it is an essential part of transforming classroom methodology and transforming learning methodologies. Now, part of creating that is creating the right environment and the culture. So one of the streams of our strategy, we had 6 streams, is the e-culture strategy. Now, initially, Warda was appointed to do that. She's moved on since then. But I think she must comment a little bit about the importance of creating that culture so that tech has got a far greater impact than just the kind of what was used this morning as Al Gore, who spoke about overhead projectors. So it's moved on from there. But
I mean, when we speak in the Western Cape, when we look at EdTech and we look at potential solutions, then we're looking at it to speak to the variety of schools and school types that we have. So we've got the super rich and we've got the really, really, really poor. And we've got to find a solution or find things that speak to the maturity levels of all of these groups. And it is that we're really looking at. So we're not looking at one type of EdTech, but we're looking at the EdTech solution, let's call it that, that's going to speak to the dichotomy that we have within the province, and that's going to speak to the maturity level of the end user, teacher, and the learner. And that's also going to be able to fit into the kind of infrastructure that we already have. And also to address the problems that we're experiencing, where we've got multi-grade classes, and we've got 60, 70 kids in a class. And these are the realities that we are facing. And then we've got the other example where you've got 12 kids in the class, and they can be engaging with all sorts of different solutions, the wonderful forward-thinking ones. Mr. Schreuder and I happen to be very, very forward-thinking people who also have to cater to the normal laggards and slow adopters and all of that. But you'd be surprised, always in Africa, and I do get this quite a lot, is the expectation both with ourselves as Africans and with the Northern Hemisphere individuals. We sometimes beat ourselves over the back thinking that we're not quite there, but in all of the conversations that I've been exposed to today, there's been a constant hammering on values, on culture, on diversity, on acceptance, on transformation. Our strategy is called Transform to Perform, and that's exactly what we're doing. We're transforming the entire layer, Technology is going to support that transformation. It's not going to replace the system that we've got. We will flip our system ourselves with the assistance of technology at the various maturity levels. That's the plan.
So the reason why we've actually embarked entirely on the e-learning strategy a couple of years ago was because of the diversity that exists in our country and across the rest of the space. We've got, of the richest, the most affluent schools. Those kids go home. First of all, they've got good teachers, so they study a full period, they work a full period. They go home, they've got digital devices at home, they have Wi-Fi, they've got
Cell phones.
internet connectivity. They can access learning 24/7. But 70% of the kids in the Western Cape, even more across the country, comes from a poor community. They do not have that. So the diversity that exists will simply in the next 10 years, if we did nothing, just increase, with the affluent having greater learning access. We have to change that. So part of the way of doing that is creating the enabling environment with digital resources, digital learning, digital opportunities for the poorer 70%, whilst the others keep going. Hence, our 28 or 30,000 devices that we've put into schools have not been random. They've been in particular experimental or model schools and in poorer community schools. So that full classes and full schools, as an experimentation, have got one-to-one devices. Now, the reason we do that is because we believe that very often in your poorer communities, the teachers are also more challenged and the resources are far greater challenge. And those learners have less learning time productively in a class. They go home and do not have access or resource. And so the reality of the learning opportunities for the affluent and for the poor are stark, the realities. So part of what we want to do is to give the learning opportunity, and the cliche of flipped classroom might be it. I prefer to really say create learning opportunities for the poor through resources they can access anytime through Wi-Fi, in Wi-Fi hotspots, or through Wi-Fi in the school, which must cover the entire space so they can go after hours. And if necessary, augment the learning or circumvent some of the poor teaching that happens whilst we're upgrading the teachers. Not replacing teachers, but whilst we're upgrading it, that's going to take 20 years. So we have a multiple strand strategy that is also putting learning into the space of learners. And fundamental to that is if any startup company thinks you can simply put a tech solution and get educational outcomes, you're lost. You have to understand that it's the total package. Hence, our mindset shift program, our attitudinal shift, changing the outlook of kids and giving them hope, whilst we uplift that very same despondency of teachers into a positive approach. And the one thing we're seeing in the Western Cape, and the other guys can comment on that, is teachers are streaming in their hundreds to self-development programs and development programs on offer. It's fantastic to see. It's humbling. And I think it's going to make quite a significant change in the next years.
I think one of the most interesting things on the transformation you talked about is what are you transforming from and to? So I think, again, often in the developed world, we think, how can we transform education because maybe some of us don't like the form it's taking. The transformation you're enacting, and this is as true of South Africa as other places, is from nothing to something. So, I mean, just to give you an idea of maybe for those who don't know the context that well, 78% of children in South African schools who are age 9 or 10 can't read for meaning. So they have no ability to access education because they can't read, effectively, right? South Africa came bottom or near bottom in PISA of both science and math. So admittedly one of the few African countries who produces good enough data to enter, but gets the worst results. Only about a third of South African students pass the basic PISA mathematics bar. That's South Africa, which at least has relatively universal provision at some level or another. In Nigeria, 10.5 million children are out of school. So what you're actually transforming from is often from either what they call in the school but not learning, which is what's commonly happening in South Africa, or you're transforming from literally not attending school whatsoever. So the ability for transformation is absolutely enormous. You know, again, the example of what Siafunda and Zakani are doing, you're transforming someone who may not have a maths or science teacher to at least having one. Yeah. The second thing I'd say is that one of the things I really like about what the Varkey Foundation do and what a lot of this conference is about is that I think what you don't need, whether it's in South Africa or the rest of the continent, is people coming along with kind of space-age solutions that aren't based in the reality that for most people, a teacher-led education is the most important thing. And I really like you guys' emphasis on how investing in teachers is the best thing to do. And I think that one of the things is really important on the continent is I often say that in Africa you can't afford to invest in things that don't work. You can't afford to muck about, because I think sometimes in the UK I would often see education technology that was quite frivolous, but that's okay because you get a good education, say, in 9/10 of your lessons, and then there's maybe an edtech product that doesn't work especially well, but who cares because 90% of your education was good. If Steele-Maley or Matabe or whatever it is your only shot, you really need that to work. And so I think that one thing I would like to see in South Africa come on a bit faster is the evidence-driven nature of the debate. So I think one thing which we're trying to do with Ingenie Cohort 2 is put more emphasis on evidence-driven innovation and impact measurement. And I think that that's a really important part of this conversation, that we absolutely do great things in building infrastructure out, give more kids Wi-Fi access, give more kids tablets, upgrade teachers' skills to use those, but also building the evidence-based understanding. So it was good. I saw quite a few African entrepreneurs who I know were in the session with Daisy Christodoulou earlier. What do edtech companies need to learn? And that is the kind of thing that we need to have more of, I think.
So it's an interesting question. I agree entirely. But if I listen to the startups that we had, including some of the winning startups, what innovative startup has evidence base to launch it?
Well, I think, so what we go with is we always say, absolutely no one who applies to Ingenie, for example, which is for early stage startups, if someone did apply with a 3-year randomized control trial, we'd be impressed, but it isn't going to happen, right? So what we say is, what existing evidence is there in education that proves what you do might be effective? So I'll give you a good example. One of our companies is called Mweli, mobile school in Swahili. They have taken the adaptive learning principle, which has had mixed results in Western countries used in schools, but MindSpark in India has shown can be extremely effective in after-school learning. So there's a large randomized control trial that proved the effect of that. What they've done is taken similar technology, a similar after-school approach in maths and English, but brought the cost down to $1 a month and made it work on feature phones. So you've made something that we know works dramatically more accessible. And that's the kind of thing that we support. So I think you're right, Brian, that is the great challenge, is as an early stage innovation, you'll never have the evidence. But I think what you can try and do is you can try and say, from first principles, this is why this could work, as opposed to coming forward with something which you say, well, hang on, but that's the same as that randomized control trial did, but it didn't work. So we're trying to get better, I think, and everyone should try and get better at selecting things which, at least from first principles, are able to work. So let's give Zakani another plug. Steele-Maley, we know that great direct instruction from good classroom teachers in maths and science is effective, and we know that maths and science is a huge area of problem in South Africa. So again, that's something I feel like has an evidence base behind it, which means it could work.
And anyone that is here that hasn't had a chance to talk with Justine Castle a little bit, or Phil Schmidt is here from MIT, I think that we'll grapple with this over the next couple of years, of course, in that random control trials in educational technology, or really anything at this point, are probably going by the wayside. If you're actually innovating and you're actually mutating a field, design-based research is really where those folks are angling, and a lot of universities only because it's going to be such a changing landscape. But I agree with you completely. Brian, and Kirsty, did you have anything to add on that part?
No, I'm good.
Okay, so what is, and I do want to open it up to the floor in a couple minutes here. What is the relationship that you see with learning scientists, with universities, and whether it's ed tech, obviously learning we've talked about as well, and then the structure and context of learning is incredibly important. But what are those relationships, and how does that work?
Yeah, they're lousy, and we're building on them. In South Africa, we've got 4 of the best universities in South Africa in the Western Cape, and yet they are slow to move. They are historically slow to move curricula. Yeah. We've been talking to our universities for 3 years about what the teachers, for example, are, what their skill set needs to be when they come up, particularly in the digital world. We're talking about a future-based education. We had that strategy early last year. We're talking about the skills that teachers need to transform education and in the digital world. The kids are still coming out of universities without those skills. So it's a slow movement, but at least we've got the conversation going. We've got interest that is now happening. All the faculties are not yet supportive sufficiently. There's not enough research from all the universities, for example, that is based on South Africa. So we talk about the necessary evidence, but our universities are not contributing to that satisfactorily. Conversation is there. We've created regular forums, quarterly forums, with our curriculum people, for example, and our e-learning people with the 4 universities in the Western Cape. We've encouraged them, for example, to help us with research through master students, for example, to speak to us about the conversations about what needs to be researched, and get master students at the university to direct or to help direct some of the research that's going there. So from our side, it's a positive attitude and approach. There's really some good response from it, but it's slow and highly needed.
True.
Any universities out there? So I want to take, and Jillian, am I about right? 15 minutes? Perfect. I want to take some time, obviously, to get questions for the panel, from those of you in the audience, and hopefully we can continue the rich discussion that's happened through your questions and insights. So I open the floor to your questions, and someone with a microphone is right behind that will be with you.
Hello. So my question would be to you guys, I mean, representing the government and the establishment, which is often the problem. What are you doing to, as a startup, I know, I've knocked on many doors. What are you actually doing to, you talked earlier about nurturing entrepreneurs, all right? What are you actually doing to lessen the barrier that entrepreneurs have to go through in order to actually get access to you? But also, what are you doing to, because it seems there's a lot of funding going towards incubation and everything else, but what entrepreneurs really need is business to actually get like 5 schools and to get those schools paid for to actually start implementing their solutions. Because it seems like whenever we're going into saying, okay, we have a solution here, we want to get started, it's always get incubated and then get incubated again. But when it comes down to actually getting the deals done and getting those solutions integrated into the schools, so there's still a big problem for that. So what are you doing to sort of lessen the barriers there?
Yeah, let's be controversial. There are many guys who want government to pay for their ideas and for the development of their ideas. That's not answering your question, though. First of all, we're not going to buy something that's not got a proven track record and that will definitely do what we want to do. We're not going to buy an idea. We're going to buy a solution. And that has to be proven. But what we do need to do is we need to create innovation. What we seek, there's a lot of money around. So when guys come to us, we say, that's a lousy idea, let's think about it again. Or they come to us and we say, I'm talking Western Cape now specifically, which is different to the rest of the nation. Or we say, that's a great idea, let us try to find funding to pilot it so that we can see that it works, because that can strengthen my hand in fighting for government funding to go towards it. I'm not sure that there's a lot of money going into incubation. I think Jamie might say there's a hell of a lot more needed. But there is some funding going into it. Part of the challenge is the bureaucratic procurement strategies and the red tape associated with it, whether it's to start up a company or to get some idea into a government context. The Western Cape, again, has got a slightly different view on that. It's got a view with cutting red tape, with creating easier opportunities, and sometimes we go round ways. For example, we go with incubation through agencies that we support that does that instead of government saying we want to. Some of us, including me, disagree that that ought to be the solution. We ought to be putting out opportunities and requests for particularly aligned solutions to our problem. We're not doing that sufficiently because of the bureaucratic red tape, particularly in the South African or in the African context. In Africa, you've got the additional challenge around corruption, which sometimes adds to it, and which adds to the complexity of the issue, and that needs to be fought, we believe, quite strongly. So, because we don't have a lot of money in government, in our province we have an increase of 28,000 learners coming in after the year started. We don't get the money that corresponds to it, so class sizes are growing. We're 2,000 teachers short and growing by 650 every year. So we don't have money to spend on something that is not definitively going to enhance education dramatically. At the same time, I fight with our own politicians about saying you can't just say we haven't got money for this when we look into a future-focused education that's going to change the world. So I'm fighting for a budget that says, let us spend where we need to spend, but let us also put some money ahead for a future-focused education, of which, in our view, the digital resourcing is fundamental to it. We are trying to change the thinking of government. It is, however, true that it still remains a challenge, and government's not inclined to fund startups because it's public money that we would pay at risk, high risk potential solutions. So we encourage, if I can just say, sorry, we encourage people to go find funding and come to us with solutions that's piloted and proven, and then we'll try to engage with it.
There is CEDA as well, the Small Enterprise Development Agency. That is a government agency that South African startups can go and approach. There's also Westgrow that also looks at seeking funding to assist small businesses. But we're not in the business, we're in the business of education. Western Cape Education Department, we're a government agency. We're an implementing organization. We don't provide funding for startups, unfortunately. However, we're always very interested when people come to us with super fabulous ideas and say, I've got this and I've got that, and we say, you know, there's a kernel in there that we can use. And for that, we're willing to pilot with your funding.
And even add, for example, if there's a great idea, we don't endorse, but we are prepared to speak to potential funders that you find and say, we think this is a great idea, so that we support the intention of trying to get funding for sound EdTech solutions.
Yes, hi. I'm Bilal Shamout from Affect Edu. We're a education technology startup. We do big data analytics and intelligence for schools. We're looking to get incubated, as well as a partner to pilot with. Good news, doesn't cost you anything. Would you be willing?
Good news.
Would you be willing to talk to us?
Let's have a conversation. You're speaking to the right two people.
But let me also say to you that it's not a barren terrain. There's a lot of research being done. There are a lot of examples that are already in space, so you're going to have competition.
Good morning. Thanks very much. My name is Julian from South Africa, and I'm heading up a new a teaching scholarship program. I guess my question is going to go out to everyone here. We looked at probably about 30 tech ed solutions, and then ultimately kind of came to the realization that at the end of the day, no system can surpass the capacity of your educators. And tech ed has to be an enabler of that core problem, otherwise it's very peripheral. And I'd just be very keen to understand how you're going to tackle that from your respective positions. I mean, you speak about 4 universities. However, the top university in Africa, UCT, has 130 education students. That's nothing in the larger scheme of things.
And not pre-service.
And not pre-service, absolutely. Number 2 in that list is very untransformed, and it's not going to be meeting the needs of your schooling base. You know, so some kind of fascinating dimensions there, and I think, like, let's not move away from that core. From your own seats, where do you feel that you're addressing that issue of the capacity that you're trying to provide for your solution cannot supersede the quality of the educators?
I'd jump in on that straight away. So we have sort of 4 core principles that guide the startups we take in. One of them is empower teachers, don't replace them. So we simply do not believe that teachers on a large scale are going to be replaced by technology at all. And the route to improving education on the continent is largely going to be improving the quality of teaching. So we have 2 startups in our first cohort. One of them, Accelerated, are here. Speak to them. They do coaching and mentoring of in-service teachers, because over half of teachers in South Africa are aged over 40. So the initial teacher training program at UCT is not actually that relevant to the problem. It's actually those guys who are over 40 who are the bulk of the teaching profession. And secondly, we have a company called Utini who teach Zulu and Xhosa to in-service teachers to allow them to serve their community better. More broadly, it's probably, if I was to look at the 3 things we would most look for applications to our second cohort in terms of education problems, it would be raising teacher quality, addressing literacy in students, and then getting people into work. So I think that we absolutely see it as a core problem. And we absolutely, in all of our technology that we bring into our incubator, we try and stress that implementation through teachers is what you do. So I'd actually love to work with you to try and strengthen our teacher community. We have one. They come to Ingenia and talk to our entrepreneurs, but it'd be great to have more people, more teachers involved in talking to entrepreneurs about their products and how they can make them more teacher friendly.
I'd like to add, Jamie, one topic that I think you can also work on, and that is the question of teachers who are not home language speakers, particularly of English, to improve their English. Government does that with difficulty because of the sensitivities, but yet their own English is not necessarily always strong enough, and I think it's another area that could be a great focus point.
Do you have any more questions from the audience?
Perhaps just another response whilst the mic goes to Wendy, and that is the issue of how we see teacher development. Now, we've done teacher development for 20 years since democracy, and yet haven't moved through barriers. So we do not believe that technology is suddenly going to make great teachers. It's going to enhance good teachers. It's going to support learners with poor teachers. But we still as a government have to continue with upliftment continually of the quality of teachers that are teaching it. Whilst at the same time not waste another 20 years before we introduce them to integrate technology into teaching and learning. So it's not either or, it's not replacing the other. We have to continue with the upgrading, but at the same time integrating technology, into their quality, but also into how they integrate it into their classrooms.
Thank you.
Right, I'm Wendy Horn from South Africa. I'm a teacher, so my question to the EdTech people here and to government is, when are teachers consulted in all of this? We on the ground, you are telling us we've got these great EdTech stuff that you are going to use, it's going to revolutionize your teaching, etc. Government is saying we're going forward into the future and we're going to pay for it. And the teachers, when it comes down to us, one, it either doesn't work as well as we thought it would work. Two, we were never consulted. So many teachers, when you're not consulted, you feel disengaged from the whole process and animosity, you're not going to do it. So with the EdTech companies, yes, you're knocking on government's door and you're knocking on finance's door. I would like it for you to come and knock on the teacher's door first and see what we need and then take it forward.
Would you like to be on our selection panel?
Yes.
For our next cohort? Seriously?
Please, yes.
That would be great.
Bring in.
So no, we are massively keen to have more teachers. Let's chat afterwards. We would love to have you on our, or if there's someone even better qualified,
Wendy would
we'd
be
love to have
excellent. She's a science teacher. She's leading an EdTech school. She's leading a school
Okay.
that is leading the space. So she'd be great.
Wendy, book April the 23rd in your diary.
And I do take the whack that Wendy's given me too, because she's quite right. Government is notoriously poor at communicating and consulting. But
Hence our
there are
changed
also
approach.
a variety of representative bodies that we do consult. But the representative bodies don't get through to teachers as they necessarily ought to. If you say, how do we consult teachers? Consulting every teacher is a difficult thing, so you have to do it through representative bodies, such as the Principals Forum, such as teacher unions, etc. So there is some of that, but it doesn't get felt on the ground, and Wendy's quite right, we have to strengthen that space.
And this is why we've got the change approach that we're using now in the Transform to Perform strategy, is the recognition of the lack of consultation and the lack of change management, the lack of advocacy of these types of things. So with the advancement of technology and the pushing of technology to enhance the pedagogy in the classroom, there's a whole different strand of advocacy going out across the entire department, up and down throughout the province. So that we're pushing. But I mean, this strategy, we've only really been doing it for the last 7 months. So it's still very much at its infancy stage.
But Wendy's also correct in saying that the EdTech companies also circumvented to a large extent, understandably partly, but the conversation needs to be opened up with everyone, including with teaching.
You know, it's a very interesting thing when a creative, sorry, I know you've got another question, but it's a very interesting thing when a creative thinks, they imagine a problem and then they rush off with a solution. And then they come back and they say, oh, we've got the solution. To what problem? To an imagined problem or a real problem that's on the ground? And this is exactly why EdTechs need to consult and have teachers on the panel, or who have some education representative on the panel. We saw a number of them where we went, where was the teacher in this? Where was education in the thinking?
And
you know?
it's such a double-edged sword, right? User-centered design in education can flow both directions. And so, Wendy, if you're listening as well, because I'm sure you're an example of a wonderful teacher. We have them all over the world, But we oftentimes run into the fact that regular teachers or teachers in most schools are doing what they've always done. And so user-centered designs often come out, encouraging ed tech designs that replicate education the way it is. And so we need more teachers like you involved in those designs that are thinking in new directions versus just improvements in education to inform these.
Wendy is a top 50. Wendy is a top 50 finalist
in
this year's Global Teacher Award.
I know.
So it's certainly a great example. And
What we're finding also with the startups is there's a very quick, and any organization, not just startups, after the fact, there's we need to partner and we need to collaborate. Where was the partnership and collaborated? In your thinking, in your conceptualization of the supposed solution. Come to us with your thinking before you get to the money spent.
Yes. Well, so Kirsty, did you want to add anything about your platform and how it deals with teachers? Or?
I think there's two thoughts. One, I'd like to have a conversation with you around commercialisation of the way we've run our model in South Africa. So in our public-private partnership, it isn't that government pays us. So we've also been innovative in the way we've commercialised and the way we've managed to be able to get corporate South Africa getting behind the schools. And that's been with the support of the Deputy Minister and with the support of the partnership working together. So I think there's interesting discussion there. From a teacher perspective, I mean, one of the, when we're looking at different enabling technologies that we can add into the solution we've created, we're really, really keen to explore the use of the blockchain in terms of being able to aggregate content that comes not from necessarily a traditional publisher or not from somebody that's creating great content, but that's actually coming from the teachers or potentially coming from the learners themselves. So how do we ingest and have that content, and how do we use enabling technology to remunerate for that? So certainly to recognise is one thing, but also if we can put in a remuneration component around that, I think that there will significantly increase the adoption and uptake if there's some financial gain in terms of contributing good quality learning materials into the platform.
I think it's important on that point. It's important that we don't find that we're trying to create something that is already being provided free of charge. So, for example, in the Western Cape, we've got an e-portal, which is a completely free, online, free access portal for teachers and learners, where the teachers themselves are uploading digital content and digital resources in bite-sized chunks that we then convert into QR codes, which is then fed out to teachers and to learners. So they have free access to the material. So when one starts to think about content and digital content, that you don't start conflicting with things that's already freely and readily available. This is where we're going. Education and educational resources needs to be free. People who start thinking that education is a means of becoming millionaires and becoming, superstars, stop that thinking. Move into a different field, move into a different direction, go into a different sector entirely. If you're working in education or you want to present of your product in education, be prepared. You're going to be poor for the rest of your life because actually we need your stuff for nothing. That is how we're going to get every single learner in every single school. That is how we're going to get quality education to every single learner. And that is how we're going to stop this talking about providing. We stop that nonsense, and we provide it with the intention of giving hope, giving free access to education, and giving free access to quality education.
So for all the startups out there, of course, looking at Hyperloop One or beyond, new forms of monetization may be needed. The word free may make a few people run out of their
Yep.
Make the money from corporates and top slice away so education can be.
Do it. Find it in CSI. Find it in the CSI platform. But if you look at South Africa and you look at the Western Cape in particular, and you look at the percentage of money that we have available, and you look at the fact that we've got 28,000 kids walking into our department annually, infrastructurally, we can't build 20 schools per annum to meet that demand.
Yes.
Yet we've got edtech companies and other service providers saying, why can't we get money out of you?
I think I'll just very, very quickly on that, because there are different business models. I would just add as an addendum for anyone who's not as aware of the context that in other parts of the continent, private sector education is bigger than it is in any part of the world. So I was just in Lagos. 70% of schools in Lagos are private schools. And the Department for Education receives 15 applications to start a new private school every day. So I think it matters where you are in other major urban centres of the continent. There is no middle class, and in fact, even below the middle class, with a greater willingness to spend money than the African middle class on education.
So I think we will end on that. I know that you had a question, and if you don't mind finding whichever panelists you wanted that question to be pointed towards after the panel, that would be great. We are definitely out of time. I can't thank you all enough, but also I can't implore you all enough in the audience to seek out the. It's up to Gillian, because we're backing up on another session. I think if you can just find them afterwards, that would be wonderful. I thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. Thank you for our panelists. Big round of applause, please. Thank you so much.